thank you, Jeffrey, for agreeing to do this interview and the discussion with me. I want to start with what I've always asked everybody is how did you get interested in Russia and how did you end up going there out of that interest?
So I ended up in Russia in early 1990, May, and I had a friend who was going there coincidentally with his brother for an art exhibition, and I got to meet some Russian artists, and I decided that what was happening there was just absolutely extraordinary, and I decided that I wanted to take part in some manner, shape, or form. And so I set my sights on returning, and I ended up coming back in July and finding a place to stay. And then in September of 1990, I moved to Russia.
Okay. And you moved to Moscow, I assume, right?
I did move to Moscow, yeah.
Yeah. And at the time you moved there, did you have a job or did you have a plan for what?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't employed, but I had already, even in my first couple of trips there, figured out that there were some people that were selling Russian kitsch, things that we wouldn't really identify as very valuable in Russia at that point. There were flags
Right.
and banners and all sorts of znaczki and matryoshka dolls and all sorts of Russian things, and I found a market for it in America, and I started exporting it and located some Russian wholesale organizations that had things to sell, and I was able to buy them in rubles, and there was obviously a tremendous arbitrage between the US dollar and the ruble, so I was
Right.
buying things very inexpensively and shipping them back to the United States, and it happens that there were containers that were coming to Russia filled with consumer goods and going back to the United States empty. And I was able to take advantage of that and, basically buy entire containers for 800 euros and or dollars, as it were, and send stuff back to the
Wow.
United
That's
States.
that's a lot of small items in a big
Yeah,
container.
I ended up shipping hockey sticks and ping pong rackets, and I got to know some Russian wholesale organizations that were buying stuff from Latvia, Estonia, and there were things that were actually being exported anyway to the West. And I was able to buy them through the Russian wholesale system at much lower prices. So they
Ah,
became like gray imports into the United States.
I
Um,
see. I see. And this was still the Soviet Union while you were there.
no, it was, this was 91, 92, and the
Oh,
Soviet
okay.
Union had already collapsed.
Right.
So I was there just at that point in time, and it already collapsed. And so, yeah, I mean, we were in Russia, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, yeah. Did you work with Russians? Did you have a staff or how did
I
you
had,
engage?
I started with a couple, two or three Russian guys. I met one Russian guy, and then I kind of found another couple, and yeah, I mean, so
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I met Russians. Yeah, I wasn't working with anybody that wasn't Russian back then because there really weren't many foreigners there.
I see. And did you speak Russian or did you learn it?
I started studying the moment even before I got there to live there, and so I started, and I had already created a base for myself by the time I got there in May of 1990, and I guess within 12 months I had a decent Russian base.
Yeah. So you didn't necessarily rely on these guys to understand what was going on around you. You were
I,
able.
I had somebody that was able to translate pretty much for the first few years I was there
Yeah,
because I didn't understand a lot of stuff. But after by 1994 already I spoke Russian.
yeah. And so it's a lot of people have difficulty finding reliable partners, let's say. I mean, there was a lot of double dealing and uh,
Yeah.
things like that particularly in those early days. So you must have been lucky in the sense that you had people that were operating in business-like manner with you. Is that fair or not?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I ever got into too many positions where I was in a position to be cheated because I was just buying stuff that nobody wanted and exporting it. And then, and one of the wholesale organizations that I was doing business with had some warehousing, and they asked me if I could find somebody to rent it from them. and there was a newsletter that was going around in the hotels, and I put a little advertisement, and I got a call from Colgate Palmolive, and they needed warehousing, and they came and saw this, and they didn't like it because it wasn't up to Western standards. So we invested a bit of money and we improved it, and we ended up signing a contract to rent the warehouse space, and then we signed a contract with Colgate to manage their logistics for some toothpaste that they had coming from Egypt at that point in time. So it
Huh.
got me started in the warehouse business. But to answer your question, we didn't really have partners, so to speak. We were just we contracted ourselves. We didn't have Russian partners per se. I had Russian employees, and I had relationships with organizations that we had contracts with, but it was a bit different than having somebody that we were relying on.
Uh-huh. 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 And so it was a benefit to them because and they were getting rid of stuff they didn't know how to get rid of.
Or yeah, or in the case of Mosop Sport Priatia, we rented 500 square meters of space from them,
Yeah.
and they wanted the rent, and that's it. And they weren't. I mean, it was run by an old lady, the organization,
Uh-huh.
and she wasn't really in a position to kind of take over the warehousing operation that we set up. And throughout the period of time, we were an organization that a lot of people turned to because we knew what we were doing, and we just kind of never were in the situation where it made sense for somebody to want to kind of get rid of us. And,
Uh-huh.
and that was
Uh-huh.
kind of intuitively, I kind of knew how to allow us to stay in that situation.
Okay. And what was the name of the organization you rented it from?
Well, it was part of the Mosop. No, that was Mosop Sport Predpriatia, but It was part of kind of what was called Roskeltorg, which was Russian trading organization. It was a Russian trading organization, and there were a lot of them, and they were all located in centralized warehouses. So one floor would be owned by an organization like Optgalant, which traded in things like handbags and gloves, and another one would be in sporting goods, and another one would be in souvenirs, and they were all located in the same building. And as soon as people found out we were renting warehouse space, other people suddenly had warehouse space to rent.
Uh-huh.
And over a period of time, we rented more space from different organizations. And then at some point, we got into I would say we got into some kind of dispute with the owners of the building, who realized that we were, profiting by being there, and they decided that they didn't want, that they wanted something for that.
Uh-huh.
But the
Beyond the
two,
rent.
yeah,
Beyond the
beyond the
rent.
rent.
Yeah.
But the guys that were doing this, they were in their 70s,
Uh-huh.
and we just basically were able to were able to counteract what they were trying to do by going out and just buying shares of the organization from the shareholders. Well, the employees had all become shareholders, and we put a van out front, and we just started buying shares until we had control of the enterprise, and we were able to fire the directors.
Ah,
But these guys weren't mafia. I mean, they
all
were
right.
just Soviet directors that were trying to keep control of what they had, or trying to make the most of what they had. And at some point, they thought that they could leverage their ownership of the lifts in the building, let's say.
Yeah.
And we had worked there, and we kind of knew everybody in the building. We'd been there for a few years by the time this all kind of happened.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there were disputes, but we weren't dealing with the mafia. I mean, it
Right.
wasn't like
Right.
they were just guys that one way or another had hoped to make something from what we were doing, and we were able to kind of do an end run around them and buy the organization, and we took it over and we ran it for many years afterwards.
And did you keep the same name?
We it was yeah, we kept Opt Galant. We bought the enterprise called Opt Galant, which was a big building, and there were other enterprises within it. We kind of either bought or rented their space for long periods of time. But Yeah, I
Okay.
mean,
Obgyn, how do you?
opt for optovy,
Oh,
meaning wholesale.
right.
So
Oh,
optovy galanteria was what it meant.
I see. And do you think they resented that foreigners were coming in and making some money, and here they were, guys who put their whole careers on this, and it was their country, and there you were making money off of their assets? Do you think there
Yeah,
was
I
that?
mean, to some degree, yes. But another degree, I already knew these guys pretty well. I mean, I had been working day in and day out in the building, in the organization. You know, we had had a relationship, we had had contracts with them. And so I think it wasn't, I think that there were just, they were coming to an end of a career and an end of an era. But I don't think there was really any hard feelings. It was kind of, they saw the writing on the wall. And to some extent, we had no choice but to kind of grow and take advantage of the opportunity to buy what was there. And yeah, I mean, I ended up kind of taking over all of the employees in the organizations there. So we ended up very quickly with 500 people, and
Uh-huh.
so, the relationship wasn't, how would you say, there were aspects of it which were antagonistic, but at the same time, you know, at the same time, they were symbiotic.
Yeah.
And so maybe they were suing us on one day, but we were working together at the next day. And
Uh-huh.
so it was just trying to gain some advantage in a way. And it wasn't, but it wasn't extremely antagonistic. And to some degree, we had good working relationships with these people at the same time as we were trying to maneuver for position, let's say.
Right, right. And so you ended up with 500 Russian employees.
Hmm.
And did they, did they, what did they think about all this? Do you know? I mean, did they?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I kind of have. They got to keep their jobs, and a lot of people are
Mhm.
losing their jobs. And there was definitely, and I was a pretty well known person in this organization and was hands on, and I had good relationships with people within,
Uh-huh.
and we tried really to treat everybody well, and it was a kind of, it was part of the DNA that I put in the organization, that we were trying to keep everybody employed, and and did try and maintain some level of welfare. And so there were probably pig farms that we owned and other assets and camps and stuff. And there, we kept some of that stuff going. And, I think people were pretty apprised of the fact that everything was changing to a capitalist system. And we were basically taking Soviet assets and just restructuring them to work in a capitalist system. And
Mhm.
so I don't think anybody was resentful about it. I mean,
Mhm.
the people that were down and working in the warehousing part of the business were, doing the same thing they'd always been doing, just for a slightly different person and with different products that had much more opportunity. So,
Yeah.
our clients were Colgate and Johnson and Johnson and pharmaceutical companies, and companies from India in those areas, and yeah, health and beauty aid companies. So people were seeing what was coming through the warehouse. These were just, it wasn't our merchandise. We weren't trading, but they were seeing that this was better quality stuff than what they had been storing before. And so I think
Mhm.
that there was an understanding that this was just, the writing again was on the wall. It was a
Yeah.
transition.
Yeah. And do you think they considered that they were working for foreigners or they were working for Russians, or did it even make any difference?
I don't think it made a big difference.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, I think there was, back then, there was more trust of foreigners than there was of Russians,
Mm.
and particularly Americans. And I learned to speak Russian. I was able to communicate with people. I was constantly there. I was a young guy. I mean, I was in my 20s,
Right.
and and we were doing things constantly to improve what, we're getting new forklifts, and we were building, new shelves, imported shelves, and, fixing the floors and ripping out asphalt and putting in concrete. And, so we were constantly upgrading stuff. We started a document storage business, which, was really new for Russia. So, there were some very, very low ceilinged warehouses that you couldn't fit, two or three pallets of stuff in them. So it made sense to try and repurpose it. So we came up with the idea to do document storage.
Mm.
And people watched all this stuff and they understood that what was going on was basically good. And, I wasn't, I was working in a pretty local kind of way, and living in a kind of, it was kind of colloquial already by this time. So,
Yeah. So you live near this warehouse?
no, I mean, I lived on the other side of Moscow, but,
Right, right.
I
And
could get there.
yeah. And socially, did you hang out with people from the warehouse, or is it, as the owner, it was kind of a distance?
No, I mean, there was a lot of social events, and I was always at them.
Uh,
Most of my friends were Russian, but so I had lots of Russian friends, but I just had the friends that I had were from a different part of the society, let's say.
yeah,
So
yeah,
my friends were artists, filmmakers, they were just from a different part of society. But I mean, those people, I knew them pretty well for
yeah,
many years. And even after I left the business and sold it in the early 2000s, I mean, I stayed friends with many of them for many years, so.
yeah, yeah. So you kind of kept some of that, excuse me, um, you you kind of kept some of that social welfare aspect of Soviet enterprises. I mean, that there were camps and kindergartens, or I don't know what, birthday parties and things like that. That you
Yeah,
kind
there
of
was
kept.
we kept the collective together.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah. And when you say that, is that 500 people, or is it a core group of 20, 30 managers, or?
yeah, I would say that there was certain people. There was probably a core group of people, but yeah, I mean, it grew. I mean, we grew from, probably 20 people to 200 people inside of 2 years. And over another 3 or 4 years, it became 500 people. But I mean, and we adopted them as we adopted the warehouse space. So if we, rented or bought more warehousing, the people that were working there came with it.
Uh-huh.
Um, but yeah, there was probably a core group of people who, were I was closer to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
Did you have like training programs, or did you feel like you needed them at all in order to change the
I
culture
wasn't
there?
I wasn't that close to the actual onboarding of or transitioning of people in the organization to their new roles and basically working with, what were the systems. I mean, we computerized, but this is still going back to the early 1990s or mid 1990s. So there was a certain level of automation and but we were still using a lot of old Soviet systems in terms of keeping inventory.
Mm,
And so the merchandise changed, but the actual systems there remained the same for quite a period of time. And
right.
so, I mean, I don't think there was that much new training going on. I mean, there was some introduction of things, but I wasn't on a day-to-day basis involved with that. So
Okay. But the systems that you inherited were efficient enough that you didn't feel an immediate need to change
they
them.
were very efficient. Yeah. I mean, actually, they were very efficient. I mean, for Colgate, I know that Colgate actually kind of gave us some kind of recognition as having the least shrinkage of any of their warehouses in Europe.
Really?
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we did well.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how long did you were you in this warehousing business then?
From when we started it in 1992 until I think I sold it in 2002 or 2003.
Yeah, yeah. And were you involved with any other businesses during that period, or were you focused on the warehousing?
Well, there was another major business that I was involved with, which was sheet materials from wood, which is plywood and particle board. And then beyond that, I was involved with some other deals, let's say. But the main one was in 1993. I bought into a plywood factory in the Kostroma region, and I had been invited basically to invest in their privatization auction. I had already been purchasing plywood, or basically helping an English company buy plywood from the factory,
Uh-huh,
and helping the factory export it through a through a government foreign trade organization, in fact,
uh-huh,
because the factory didn't have the license initially to export on their own. And so we invested some money and won a significant share of the voting stock, and it kind of put me into a position where I became the de facto head of the factory, because things couldn't happen without me and my block of stock.
right.
And so, there was a lot of responsibility that came with that. But I was very much of the mind to try and build something and help the factory and develop it. And so, I went out and, raised some money to help rebuild the particle board part of the factory.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Why did you have to rebuild it? Was it not just poor quality or?
yeah, the quality was, yeah, pretty
Yeah,
bad.
yeah, yeah. So that was a bad inheritance from Soviet times.
Yeah, I mean, but it wasn't a difficult. Let's put it this way, for very little money, we were able to buy what was a significant enterprise, and then for, again, what wasn't so much money, really upgrade the quality of the particle board to, European standard for, a couple $1 million, which, really helped the factory out a lot.
Yeah. So were you then had to be present in Kostroma often, or were you kind of were you
No, I was there constantly,
yeah,
weekly. Yeah, I
yeah,
drove up there probably every week for 5 years.
every week, right? From
Mhm.
Moscow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I would spend a couple days there. I had a place up there where I would go and stay.
Yeah, yeah. Did you, how was it, could you describe the difference you felt between Moscow and Kostroma in those days?
Yeah, it was poor, but even more so, we would work with logging organizations where we were buying the trees from, and we
Mhm.
actually acquired some of the logging organizations. And we would go to those villages and see what they were like, and they were horrible. They were really desperate at that point in time. There was a moment where they had no money at all, and there was very little there. And
Yeah,
so, yeah, it was tough. I mean, Kostroma was also pretty bad at that moment in time.
right.
The restructuring hadn't really taken place, so there were a lot of, rusting industrial assets without people coming there to do anything. And so, they just slowed down to a halt in many instances.
Yeah. So you were unusual in that environment as someone who took responsibility for this transformation of this old enterprise. And that is that true?
No, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
look, I fell into a situation where there were really good guys. The general director, although he was a bit of a mafia and trying to control the distribution of the plywood that was sold locally, he started out on the shop floor as somebody working in the presses, and he spent 30 years in the factory. And so, from a technical standpoint, he was an excellent guy. And although we had our moments in terms of, some of the financial aspects of how the factory was run and his positioning in the factory, and he eventually we had to demote him from being general director. But we actually had a lot of, we saw eye to eye with a lot of things because we wanted to change certain things in the production. And, I got, pretty involved with opportunities to change the way we were using the plywood and making the plywood so that it would be more valuable and cost less to produce. And so, there was a certain respect there because, I mean, they clearly understood I wasn't just coming in to rob the factory, but that I was
Uh-huh.
trying to make it a better place. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was,
And what, so you develop new markets for that factory and export to Europe of plywood?
yeah, we opened up new markets, yeah.
Yeah.
And we were able to sell directly into markets that previously we were only able to sell to through what was export less or other, let's say, brokers. So we were able to
Yeah.
sell directly to retailers selling the plywood in the UK.
Yeah. Well, how were you able to do that?
Just, old fashioned, cold calling people, getting on the phone, talking to them.
Right.
Um, you know, yeah,
It's
there
just
was,
cultural skills that the
yeah,
Russians didn't have.
yeah. I mean, they had a good department. It wasn't exactly a marketing department. It was more of a sales department overseeing the sales of the product, but they weren't reaching out and they weren't going to trade shows and they weren't, calling potential buyers in other markets because that had been the purview of export less.
Uh-huh.
And so we started to do that. But I mean, I was doing that simultaneous. So we were exporting plywood from there simultaneous to export less. And then export less was basically, they didn't exactly fall apart, but we no longer needed to work through them. The factory got its own export license. And so it was able to export directly. And so we started to export different products to different markets. Egypt
Mm.
was a big market for drawers, for a certain type of plywood for drawer sides. And
Huh.
so, yeah, we would entertain Egyptian buyers, and they would come and they would give us down payments, and we would sell them plywood for their business.
Huh. And so I assume you were pretty cost competitive at that point in those foreign markets.
Yeah, well, Russian manufactured plywood suffered from a notable discount because the Finns were able to sort of con or bribe the Russian export less, who was also responsible for buying equipment for the factories, and this ministry that was responsible for running these factories kept the Russian factories on a pre-war standard. So we were selling 5 by 5 foot plywood into a 4 by 8 market. So buyers were hoping or buying 4 by 8 plywood for a much higher price than they were paying for 5 by 5 plywood. And so Russian plywood was basically, the manufacturers were kneecapped by the fact that they were producing the wrong size plywood for the most part. There were markets that were able to take the 5 by 5 plywood, like carpet gripper rod and other stuff like that, and we were able to sell into those markets, but we were getting probably 30 or 40% less per cubic meter than somebody that was selling a different shaped plywood board.
Okay. And so I assume then you changed that. You changed this.
It changed. It eventually changed, but after I left, after I sold the factory, we weren't able to change to a 4 by 8 standard while I had the factory. We
Why
changed
not?
afterwards
Well,
because we would have needed more capital to do it. Yeah, that was probably the primary reason, is we
okay.
would have needed more money to do it than we had at that time. And at the same time, we were also improving the sales of 5 by 5. So we were closing the gap. Let's say we started selling higher grade plywood to the United States.
Uh,
I had found buyers in the United States, furniture manufacturers, that had started to order containers and were able to use the 5 by 5 plywood effectively. And so we were able to close the gap in terms of the arbitrage between 4 by 8 and 5 by 5.
I see. I see. And were there other foreigners working in the factory or just you?
No, there were no other farther. Well, okay, I brought, let's say, some people over, consultants from time to time to look at certain things, but and I had a financial director who was an American guy, but there was nobody else working in the factory. No,
Yeah. So the financial director lived there in Kostroma?
no, no, but he visited there often enough. I
Yeah.
mean, he was living in Moscow also.
Okay. Okay. And and so and the the changes you brought were in the style of business, the marketing, and what about the organization of the factory itself? Did you?
No, I mean it was actually really well run. I mean, I
Yeah.
have to hand it to the guy who was the general director when I took it over. He was a very strict guy. I mean, he didn't, he would fire people who were alcoholic, and he kept a pretty tight grip on the factory. And so it was a well-run factory before I got there, and they had managed that on their own. And
Uh-huh.
so I think I just, I made certain aspects of the product development, and um, more dynamic than they might have otherwise been. I mean, the guys knew what they needed to do. They knew they needed to upgrade the particle board. It wasn't that
Right.
I went in and told them that this is what needed to happen. They told me that it's what needed to happen. So
Right. Right. But you had the connections and the capital to make it happen, which they didn't.
yeah, we raised money, and yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
but we were raising money at a very, very unstable time. So I mean, the factory, we raised probably $5 million, and we're able to probably actually invest less than half of that, because going back to the time when we were making these investments, the ruble was devaluing very quickly against the dollar, which was a good thing because we were selling in foreign currency. And so there was a tremendous inflation on the one hand, but the ruble was against the dollar, always weaker and weaker. So
Uh-huh.
there was a kind of equilibrium. But
Hmm.
when the election of Boris Yeltsin came on, um, let's say, the Americans that were helping run the reelection campaign, and let's say, the reformers who were trying to get Yeltsin reelected, decided that a weak ruble wasn't helping the case to get Yeltsin reelected.
This is
So
96. This is 96 election, correct?
yeah, so
Yeah.
this is when basically they decided to change the nature of the devaluation of the ruble, and they actually made it stronger almost overnight. And
Uh-huh.
there was a moment in time when the ruble was running around 9 to the dollar, and we woke up the next morning and it was 6 to the dollar. And so we were getting many less rubles for our dollars, and as a result, things changed. We weren't able to buy the raw materials that we needed to buy, um, and yeah, we struggled through this period, and we had debt. The factory had always had debts, and the debts were, I mean, how do
Dollar
you say?
debts? They were dollar
No,
debts?
they were ruble
Ruble
debts,
debts. Okay.
which was fine back then because the ruble
Right.
was devaluing against the dollar. But suddenly we had a third more debt, and it was no longer devaluing. And
I
so
see.
yeah, and so while we were had planned to use this money that we kind of raised to invest in the factory and even to start a new line of veneer production, we weren't able to do that because we were forced to pay off this debt, because this debt was so expensive, and suddenly was running at a rate that we couldn't afford to keep it anymore.
Ah, I
So
see.
keeping the ruble debt wouldn't have been a problem had the ruble continued to devalue against the dollar.
And so when you raised the money, how did you raise it? These were you borrowed from Russian banks or from Russian
No, no,
oligarchs or who?
from the U.S. government.
From the US government. Ah,
Mm.
okay. So these were dollar denominated debts or ruble denominated debts that you got from the U.S. government?
No, no, we didn't. The debt that we had was kind of just it was bank debt that the factory had historically.
Okay. That is
Um,
historical debt. Okay.
yeah, and some of it related to the fact that the Russian government decided, in its wisdom, at one point to start collecting VAT from factories on goods that were supposed to be exported. So goods that were exported weren't subject to VAT.
Uh-huh.
And what happened was the guys that were exporting gold from Russia weren't actually exporting it. They were pretending to export it.
Uh-huh.
And this kind of the government got wind of this. And suddenly the government decided that that all exports from Russia would have VAT charged on them until such a time as the factories could prove that the goods had actually been exported. And to prove it, they wanted a government document from the government where the goods had been exported.
Uh,
And yeah,
okay.
this was a really onerous requirement.
Yeah.
And we suddenly, when this happened, we fell into debt immediately because we were paying VAT suddenly
I see.
on goods that were being exported, which was about 80% of the value, the value of the factory. Even if it was only 50% of the actual goods, it was 80% of the value. And so we suddenly had to come up with, hundreds of thousands of dollars, which we didn't have. So we would borrow this money from the banks. And then when the ruble became stronger and it stopped valuing, the debt was denominated in rubles, and the price on the interest rate was set. That didn't
Right.
change. And
Right.
so it coincided with when we had raised about $5 million from the U.S. government, which was equity. It wasn't a loan. We got an
Okay.
equity infusion, but unfortunately, we had to use most of that equity infusion to deal with the debt that the factory had had.
I see.
And so these were just, I mean, that was just the kind of like what was coming at us on a daily basis, these kind of changes, macroeconomic changes.
Right. Right. So when you got the money from the U.S.
The
Russia
U.S. Russian Investment Fund, yeah.
investment fund, TUSRIC, right?
Hmm.
So did they come looking for you or did you go looking for them?
No, I approached Tusriff, and they were looking for an investment at that point in time that was bricks and mortar because they had invested in a startup between Columbia Hospital in New York and Pepsi Cola in Russia for some reason, and they tried to build a clinic. They built like a kind of small but very expensive clinic with American doctors that were flying back and forth first class, and they blew through a few $1,000,000 in about 18 months. It was like their first deal, and they were looking for something a bit more, let's say, just bricks and mortar stuff you could
Right.
find,
Right.
and a plywood factory appealed to them at that point in time.
Uh-huh.
And we had a good story. I mean, actually, plywood is a very good product, and Russian plywood is very well made, and there was plenty of markets for it.
Right.
Um, Go ahead.
Yeah. So was TUSRIF headed by Pat Carty at that point or not?
No, that she came later.
She came later.
It was run by Austin Butner at that point.
Okay. Okay. And so you were one of the early, very early
Yeah,
launch.
we were probably the second, if not the second or the third deal that they did. There was another deal which happened to be also in Kostroma, which was a bottled water company called Saint Springs. I don't know if you remember it, but it was a pretty
Yeah, I
well
do.
known.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was a pretty well known deal back then.
Uh-huh. And that one was pretty successful for them, right?
Yeah, Saint Springs went well. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did they react to the problems you were having? Were they
Um,
aware of all this? And
yeah, they were aware of it, but what happened was they had taken a huge amount of time to do due diligence on the deal.
yeah.
So from when I approached them to when we actually got money, a year
Yeah.
passed.
A year,
And
one year.
a year passed.
Whoa.
And there was a point in time when I was sitting up in Kostroma and this news about the ruble came, and I immediately knew. I mean, within minutes of hearing the news, the implications were clear. And I was with a couple of the guys from Tusrif up in Kostroma at that time, and we talked to Austin
Yeah.
and said, "Listen, this is going to completely negatively affect all the plans that we have." And I sort of gave him the opportunity to stop the deal if he thought that, because I said to him, and he implied that we would find more money, and but to go ahead because they wanted to close the deal.
Okay. Yeah.
They were under a certain amount of political pressure, to get deals closed, and we were close, and we had spent a lot of time and a lot of money on it,
Yeah.
and they just said, proceed, let's just proceed and we'll work it out.
Yeah.
And there was never a real opportunity to go back to them to try and raise more money.
Right.
But by and large, what we did, I think, saved the factory. And I think that they were appreciative of the fact that there was a good couple $1,000,000 out of the 5 million that went into change the production. And really, the reason that it was so critical is that every plywood factory has 70% of the wood goes to waste, and you
Mm.
need to do something with it. You either need to burn it or ship it away from the factory. And because the factory is in the middle of Kostroma, like right in the center of town on the Volga River,
Wow.
the opportunity to ship it was very expensive, and the opportunity to burn it wasn't really there. And some of the waste we did use to heat the ovens for the plywood, but we needed to manufacture particle board. I mean, if we weren't making 70,000 cubic meters of particle board every year, the factory would have gone bankrupt.
I see.
And so what happened was we went from having really bad particle board to having the best particle board in Russia. And so if there was a downturn in the furniture manufacturing, which there were a number of them, people would still turn to us to buy our particle board because we didn't raise the price really. We just wanted to get rid of it. We had to manufacture it. We had to sell it.
Yeah.
So we always had a market for our particle board, which is what happened.
Uh-huh.
And it really saved the factory, and that was 1,100 people.
Wow. So,
Yeah.
what was the attitude of the regional administration, the Russian regional administration, to you and to what you were doing with the factory?
It was pretty good. I mean, we had lots of interactions with the governor and with the people in Kostroma, and we bought the factory together. I mean, there were a number of auctions of shares over a period of time, and we would buy different lots of shares from the town and from Kostroma. And yeah, I mean, we had a good working relationship because we were right in the center of town. We employed 1,100 people, and they considered what we were doing pretty good. And I brought the government people there in contact with the U.S. government officials, and I actually flew with the governor to the United States, and we visited um, some factories, OSB factories in Georgia, and showed them what sheet materials production was like in the United States. And so we got to know them pretty well.
Yeah, yeah. And so you were kind of a savior for them in a sense.
I mean, I at some level, I guess the factory would have continued, but I think what we did was a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so ultimately, why did you sell it?
Well, there was really only one way to make money then at that point in time, and that was working through an offshore company. and, and it wasn't really acceptable for the U.S. government to be involved with a business which was working through an offshore company. And
Okay.
so
Can you
we were
explain why that's the case, that the only way to make money was through an offshore company?
there was too much taxation locally. And what most exporters were doing at that point in time were they were tolling factories, and so they were just they were basically buying raw materials and paying a fee to manufacture the good. So aluminum factories were famous for this, is that an offshore company would buy the raw materials to make the aluminum, pay
Yeah.
them, let's say, $25 or whatever it was to create a ton of aluminum. And
Right.
then the aluminum belonged to so the factory wasn't really making money. It was being tolled. It was being used as a manufacturing facility.
Right.
And they were doing that to avoid taxes,
Uh-huh.
which were onerous,
Right.
and rightly so, including this VAT thing was a big deal because you almost could never get the right documents to get the government to credit back the VAT. It would
Yeah.
take forever. I mean, like we're talking about a year.
Yeah.
Because when you import something into the UK or into Germany, you don't necessarily get a document that was acceptable to the Russian government to give you back the VAT. And getting the tax authorities to give you back that money was like pulling teeth. And
Yeah.
so the tolling was to get around that.
Uh-huh.
And we weren't tolling. We were working correctly, but we weren't making any money. And it was clear to everybody that you needed to work through an offshore company, which was like tolling. So, in other words, you were buying the goods from the factory at the least at a break-even price,
Right.
making money in Cyprus,
Right.
and then using the money in Cyprus and either distributing it or reinvesting it. The problem was with the factory in Kostroma is besides, although we had 75% or more of the shares because we had accumulated a supermajority, we still had 4,000 minority shareholders, which were local people who had invested their single voucher in the factory.
Uh,
And so with all those minority shareholders who wouldn't be taking advantage of what we were doing and making money offshore, it was not correct, to be seen, at least by the government. It was a very difficult thing to do, although it was probably better for the factory long term and for everybody long term. Taking the money offshore wasn't the right thing to do.
sure.
And
So
so,
you would have been, in a sense, cutting off a revenue stream from that 25.
from the factory, right? and
Right.
and we would have been depriving the factory of certain amount of the revenue in order to make money ourselves.
Yeah.
And so, in conjunction with Tusriff, we decided we couldn't do this, and therefore we needed to sell the factory. And we found a buyer to buy it, which was a Russian. It was Severstal, in fact, the big steel
Uh,
company. They had been
uh,
diversifying at that point, and they bought a few plywood mills, and they bought ours amongst
did
others.
they set up an offshore mechanism?
Whether or not they did or didn't, I don't know, but they didn't hold on to it for very long either,
Yeah.
because it turned out to be a pain in their asses to own it, and it
Yeah.
wasn't worth it. It was a tiny speck, and so they actually sold it to a group of guys that were called Sveza that were actually taking over plywood factories and doing a good job with them, and they whether or not they had an offshore
Russian
company,
guys. Russian
yeah,
guys?
Russian guys, yeah.
Yeah.
And I had contact with them because we worked with them. I had actually bought plywood from them for other places, so we were in business with them at some level, and we knew them, but we didn't sell directly to them. We sold to somebody else.
Yeah. And
And yeah.
yeah. So they ended up owning it. And do you know what happened to the factory? Is it still
Oh
operating?
yeah, it's still running. Yeah, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
and it yeah. I mean, it's got a website. You can go online. You can buy plywood there, and I think the same guys or some later version of that company still exists. And so yeah.
Yeah. Huh. So that was a successful transition from a Soviet enterprise to a, locally run or, you know,
It wasn't. Yeah, I
part.
mean, it by and large, what we did helped the factory.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think that Tusriff ended up getting about 70% of the investment back. They didn't make any money.
Uh,
And
okay.
so, but I mean, compared to if you went down the laundry list of all their investments, that was probably way ahead of the game in terms of the effect that the investment had was positive,
Right.
and the fact that they got most of their money back was also probably well ahead of most of their investments there.
Okay. So those early investments, they really just lost money on them.
Some of them did. I mean, like St. Springs was a good one. I mean, I
Yeah.
think they returned a multiple, but in venture capital, that's what happens. I mean,
Right.
you lose some and you win some big ones, and I mean, I think that Tussriff investment in Fanplit was kind of almost a break even situation, for
Mm.
all practical purposes, because they did a lot of good and they got a significant amount of PR value out of it, and I think it was by and large it was an okay deal.
Yeah. 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 So you were spending a few days a week in Kostroma, and you were also running the warehouse business at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah, that's
And
correct.
so, did you have time for anything else but work? Were you were you
I
part
mean,
of that whole expat scene in Moscow at all?
no, I mean, not so much. I mean, not so much. I mean, in the winter, cross country skiing or skiing. I mean, doing stuff like that. But I had a Russian wife and a kid, and I mean, I was pretty local at that point. So no, I wasn't very involved. I played poker with Fred Berliner, and I knew those guys well.
Oh,
So
okay,
I
okay,
was I was in that clique of people, but you
yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, we have an interview. Well, not an interview with Fred, but at least some of the things he wrote about his experience are in the archive.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so, and oh, did you belong to AmCham or Moscow Country Club or any of those things?
No, well, AmCham, I think we did at one point. We were a member. Our company was a member.
Yeah. What was the name of your company, the warehouse again?
Items Warehouse was the name of the company that belonged. Items.
Items. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so we supported AmCham at one point, but no, I mean the country club, no, not at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so so you really blended really into Russian life primarily then.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you arrived there in the early 90s, did you think you would be there that long?
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't. I mean, I didn't. I didn't bookend it anyway. I mean, but I mean, it lasted probably 5 years longer than I expected.
Yeah.
It was-
And did you was it was it adventure that brought you there, or was it the commitment to change the country, or was it something else, or was it what I mean, I don't want the details, but just kind of the over.
No, there was a sense of optimism.
Uh-huh.
There was it. We thought that actually there was going to be a change
Yeah.
in maybe somehow the mentality, but it
Uh-huh.
was it was a bit naive.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. And when did you begin to think that might be naive?
Um, the apartment bombings in 1999.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, the war in Chechnya was also pretty bad. I mean, there were a whole bunch of pretty obvious signs along the way, but hope dies last, as they say in Russia.
Right, right, right. So those kind of there were a few things then in the late 90s that said to you, "Mm, maybe my time is done here."
No, not really. It wasn't
No?
like that. It was just that because I kind of never, I didn't have much of a plan to leave Russia at any point until it just sort of happened. It was kind of happenstance um, that I left almost because I just decided to have a family and leave temporarily. I didn't even, when I left, I didn't know I was leaving permanently anyway. But yeah, it was just there were things that made it clear that the machinations, let's say, of well, that you kind of read about from earlier eras in Russian history were very much in the DNA, and that there wasn't really a new rebirth of the culture, let's say.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
That perestroika was a rebuilding, a structural rebuilding, but it wasn't a emotional change, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so was that around the time when you sold the warehouse business as well?
I would say that they both. I mean, I had kind of understood that the change wasn't, it wasn't what maybe we hoped for in the early '90s. Much before that. So, I
Uh-huh.
mean, I would say, like in the by the late 1990s, even the election and what happened around the election, after the election, and loans for shares and all that stuff, there were a lot of giveaways that things were just, that things weren't, there wasn't a real, there wasn't a whole new thing happening. It wasn't just,
Right.
that people were hungry for a change in the way that in their character, I would say, in their
Okay.
nature.
Yeah.
But I
So,
mean, I became, I had, I lived there and I changed being there. So it wasn't so much, I had to readapt after I left, was because I got pretty acclimatized to that mentality. And,
uh,
I mean, I was very native at a certain point, very organic there. And,
yeah.
and I
And
thought
is that what means self-interested or what does that mean
it
when you
just
say,
means that you think a little bit tougher.
uh-huh,
You lose a little bit of humanity. I
uh-huh,
don't know. I mean, there was just some, I tried to go back in 2010 at one point when Skolkova Foundation started up, and I had a lucrative idea, and I was offered a lucrative deal, and I could have made a lot of money probably in 2 or 3 years,
uh-huh,
but I lost the stomach for the kind of corruption that you had to be willing to, be involved with to make things happen. I just,
uh-huh.
I left and I had gone through something, and, I had kind of, you know, I lost that ability. I had lost the stomach for it.
Yeah. So you backed away from that business.
Yeah, I changed my mind about doing things,
Yeah.
doing,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just going back again a little bit. What was 1998 like for you? Does it make any impact on you? You know, the crisis in August of 1998. It was
Um,
mostly a
yeah,
financial
I mean,
crisis.
it was a great thing actually for me, business wise, because overnight we had 4 times the number of rubles to buy raw materials with at the factory,
Uh-huh.
and all of our contracts were dollar denominated in the warehouse business. So immediately we gave all of our, let's say, clients like Colgate or whoever it was, a discount of 25%, but we still had 3 times more rubles. All our costs were in rubles.
Ah,
The other thing is all of the Russian distributors of pharmaceuticals and health and beauty aids, they defaulted on basically their debt to the manufacturers, and so the manufacturers were no longer allowed to ship on credit, and they had to work through us, and we started to basically buy and resell the goods so that distributors could continue to sell to the pharmacies. And
ah,
so, yeah, and also the amount of goods that were coming, they were planned, production was planned a year in advance.
right.
So when everything shut, when all the sales went down by 50% overnight, there were still goods coming in trucks for the next 9 months. And so our warehouse was just absolutely full to the rafters. We were making more money than ever as a result of that crisis.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, and we also were tipped off that it was coming. I mean, I was having a lunch with Pavel Toplukin, from Troika Dialogue, and he heard from Nemtsov that basically they were going to default. So I had a few days to sell the GKOs that we had, and get out, and we had very little exposure when the default came.
Uh-huh.
And so yeah, it was kind of it was like a financially it was good for us, that crisis, but
Right. Right. They're quite different than some of the financial organizations
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
that
everybody got.
took a bath and many emigres who, I mean, expats who left during that period.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Peter, um, what's his name? The guy that ran Dialogue Bank.
Yeah, Peter Derby.
Yeah, Peter Derby. Yeah, he owed us a bunch of money, and but we had a lot of telecoms equipment that he had bought for a venture that he was doing, and it was in our warehouse.
Uh-huh.
And so we got lucky again, and
Yeah.
we were able to recoup what he owed us, and
Right.
but
Yeah.
okay, I mean, it was a crazy time. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. 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 So because of the warehouse, you were connected to a lot of different industry sectors then.
Yeah, well, I mean, mostly health and beauty aids. I mean, we were working mostly for Western companies, just a few Indian companies and Western companies,
Yeah.
and we were given a position where we were working honestly through customs, but that caused a problem for customs because most of the other customs points weren't working honestly, and so they needed to give us our own customs point so that we could clear customs legally for all the Western companies.
Uh-huh.
Because let's say a container would come through our warehouse and it would be worth $70,000, and a Russian importer would be importing an analogous product for 10,000, and so it couldn't happen at the same customs point.
Uh-huh.
So we were basically given a customs point to from keep the statistics looking funny at other customs warehouses, if you like.
Okay. So when did that customs post get established there at your warehouse?
I think probably 1993 or four. By
Yeah.
now, yeah, by now it was pretty early on.
Yeah. And so the foreign goods they'd come through that customs point at your warehouse, and there you are, you're storing them. So you had a pretty strong position then for that certain types of goods, right?
I mean, we were storing them. They didn't belong
Yeah.
to us. We were storing them
Right.
for
Understand that.
companies. But
Right.
yeah, and
Right.
then over a period of time, the Russian distributors started doing all the importation, and
Uh-huh.
so that we weren't. Initially the foreign companies were importing them and then selling them on an imported basis, and then that changed after a while. But yeah.
Okay, so what does it mean that the Russian distributors were buying directly from Colgate in Europe or
Yeah, well, Colgate in Russia. I mean, there was a
yeah,
legal entity in Russia, but it was probably a trading organ. It was probably a representative office. So yeah,
right,
they were probably buying from a European supplier, or
right.
and wherever it was coming from, but the contract was with a seller in somewhere in Europe, and they were importing it themselves in their name.
Okay,
So
and why was it coming in at $10,000 instead of 70,000?
well, not in our customs point, but in originally in other customs points
Right.
back when nothing didn't matter what it was. Basically, all the goods in Russia were coming in containers that were $10,000 in value. Didn't matter what was in them.
Okay.
It was back in the
It was a
day.
claimed $10,000.
Yeah, it was something like that.
All right.
And we were told at one customs point early on that we were messing their numbers up, and they didn't want us clearing customs there because we were declaring the full, real, true value of the goods.
Right.
And that
Okay.
wasn't good for them. And we went to the head of Moscow Customs and explained the story. And he said, okay, and he basically said, you can have a customs point at your warehouse as a result of that.
I see. So in the by doing the full value, you were actually paying more into the Russian government, but you were cutting out the graft for customs officials.
Wasn't us, but we were facilitating
You
it.
were
We weren't,
facilitating. Yeah.
yeah, we were
Yeah.
facilitating. Yeah.
So it was more income for the Russian government, but less income for the Russian customs bureaucracy. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
informal.
If they were, I don't know what was happening elsewhere,
Yeah. All right. Okay. 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 Well, customs was a mess in those days, right? It was just,
Yeah, I mean,
it,
it probably still is. I mean,
yeah,
but yeah,
yeah,
it was very, very bad then.
yeah. So, so who did you sell your warehouses to?
I sold my stake to my partner at the time, who was Len Blavatnik
Oh, okay.
and Access Industries. Len and I had been partners since about 1993, where
Okay.
he had invested some money, and so he was a kind of silent partner.
I see. He was a financial partner then. Yeah.
Yeah, he was an investor. I mean, he invested once, and that was that. I mean, we
Yeah.
were never we were profitable pretty much, and so it wasn't that he was investing over and over, and he wasn't, but it was like he made a good investment at that
Uh-huh.
time.
Uh-huh. 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 And so his payoff was through dividends, the payments to shareholders that you made, or yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and he still, as far as I know, he still owns the company.
Oh, okay. 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 And how many at the time you sold, how many employees and sort of how much do you know
There
square?
were like about 500 people working in the warehouse.
Yeah. Okay. And so a pretty big volume of goods were going through there on a yearly
Yeah,
basis.
yeah, it's several hundred million, I would say at least.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, so this you said earlier, this whole experience changed you as a person. And would you say at the end of the day, better or worse? I mean, for the better or for the worse? Or I maybe that's not the right way to do it, to say this. I'm just trying to get you to say a little more about what it meant to be so involved in business in those years and as you look back on it.
Mm, yeah, no, I mean that's an understandable question. Um, I think to a degree, um, there was a certain disillusionment about business as a class of human interaction, capitalism as a class of human interaction. And that while it's an extremely positive and productive generator of wealth and ingenuity and creativity, the flip side of it is that it evokes a negative part of the human personality in the form of, greed and power.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I found that what might have remained hidden from me if I stayed in, let's say, more Western endeavors, which do better at hiding the duality. The Russian experience highlighted it in a very clear way.
Hmm.
Amazing things were happening in a short period of time. Um, Incredible wealth, incredible things. People, if they could dream it, it could be done back then.
Hmm.
And that was impressive. And I'll take my hat off to the oligarchs and the guys that did what they did, because they broke a lot of eggs and they made a lot of omelets, and it was truly impressive, even if it was often difficult to watch humanity battle and beat up humanity. It was not pretty a lot of times. And so I grew up quickly in terms of understanding what, capitalism can do, and, in good and bad ways. And I think since that time, I've been a real big believer in benefit corporations as a
Hmm.
much more important form of capitalism, or a much more humane form of capitalism that I think should be adopted in a lot of places and in a lot of industries. Um, and yeah, I think that, I came to believe that, there's, a lot of good, but a lot of bad that can come, and capitalism needs to be regulated. So, if I went there with capitalist ideas, I came back a socialist to a degree.
Yeah. Yeah. And so in that sense, Russia changed you more than you changed Russia.
Oh, vastly. Yeah, I don't think I changed Russia hardly at all. And it
Yeah.
changed me a lot. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess looking at some of the changes that you did make, and not just you, but the other people that I've interviewed, that some of the change from a planned economy to a market economy was facilitated by many of you. And that those market structures and ways of economic activity are still there, even though they've got a Russian flavor and Russian owners. Would you disagree with that or agree with that?
Look, I think it's sort of like all of that, let's say, capitalist energy and all that was like, it was like a fish tank that was, it was, everything was there in the fish tank, and then the glass broke. And I don't know how different it would have been had none of, if any of us had never been there. The
Hmm.
fish would have gotten out and they would have started to propagate and they would have swam out into the ocean. And, would there have been a stock exchange if Fred didn't do that? Or, would the particle board plant get rebuilt if Tusriff hadn't invested? Or would those warehouses have been repurposed for good use? I mean, I kind of think that they probably would have been. And
Hmm.
I think we were witnesses, and in some instances, um, change makers. But by and large, I think a lot of it would have happened in any event.
Hmm.
And it was just pretty entertaining to be there and to watch it all happen, and a privilege to a degree to get to participate in it.
Hmm.
Like in, really firsthand. I mean, um, but the oligarchs were doing in, oil and gas and aluminum, telecoms, and energy, you know, what I did in plywood, and I just saw them. I wanted to stay away from all those industries because they just were clearly dangerous,
Right.
and so I was kind of mimicking to a degree what Len and Victor Vexelberg and other guys were doing, because I saw it happening. I mean, I got the ideas, from them, and I went out and I did it. But it would have happened, and even if one of the oligarchs hadn't been there, somebody else would have been there. It's
Hmm.
almost, it's capitalism is kind of human nature in a way. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I think I want to wrap it up with that.